I tried to open the bedroom door. It was locked. From inside, my fiancée said, "Wait." A man's voice added, "Almost." I didn't wait. I pushed the door in. I came home earlier than planned because my meeting in Phoenix collapsed in under an hour. The client lost funding, the return flight was open, and I took the first seat back without overthinking it. The apartment was quiet when I unlocked the door, which was unusual for a Thursday night. Fiona usually had music playing while she worked on wedding details, vendor spreadsheets, or seating charts spread across the kitchen table. The lights were on, but the place felt staged, like a room waiting for people who were not supposed to be there. I set my bag down and walked toward the bedroom to change. The door was closed. That alone was strange. We never closed it unless one of us was on a call. I tried the handle. It did not move. Someone inside told me to wait. A second voice followed, male, relaxed, unbothered, and completely out of place in my apartment. There was no hesitation in me, no internal debate. I pushed my shoulder into the door and forced it open. What I saw did not need interpretation. Fiona was half-dressed. Curtis Vaughn was pulling his shirt on like he belonged there. The bed was disturbed in a way that erased any remaining doubt. The air smelled wrong. Curtis did not scramble or panic. That calm told me everything I needed to know before anyone said another word. I asked who he was and how long this had been happening. Fiona tried to slow the moment down, reaching for control instead of truth. Curtis answered first by letting slip that he had been there before. That single detail changed the situation from betrayal to planning. I told Curtis to leave. He hesitated until I stepped closer. He grabbed his shoes and phone and moved toward the door without urgency, as if he expected to return later. That assumption set something off in me, and I put him against the wall long enough to make it clear he was not coming back. I did not hit him. I did not need to. The message landed. Fiona tried to block me from following him out, placing herself between me and the door. I moved her aside and watched Curtis disappear down the hallway. When I returned to the bedroom, I locked the door myself and demanded the full truth immediately. What came out was fragmented but revealing. This was not a mistake. This was not a single night. Curtis had been coming over when I traveled. Fiona had coordinated around my schedule. The wedding planning had continued at the same time, with the same enthusiasm, while this was happening in parallel. I picked up Curtis's phone from the dresser before Fiona noticed. The screen lit up with messages that erased any remaining ambiguity. There were references to my work trips, access codes, and comments about how careful Fiona was being. There were jokes about timing and money. I handed the phone back without comment. Fiona saw my expression change and knew the situation had crossed a line she could not talk her way back from. She admitted it had been going on for months. That was when the apartment door opened again. Fiona's sister Nina walked in, stopped short, and immediately understood what she had walked into. Her presence answered a question I had not yet asked. Fiona had texted her earlier, preparing for something. That meant tonight had not been impulsive. It had been scheduled. Nina tried to mediate. She tried to slow things down, asking everyone to breathe and sit. Her words made it worse. She knew more than she should have. She let slip that she had been aware Curtis existed, though she claimed she believed it would end before the wedding. That moment shifted my focus. This was no longer just about Fiona and Curtis. This was about how many people had watched me plan a wedding while knowing I was being set up to look like a fool. I checked the joint account on my phone. The balance was lower than it should have been. There were withdrawals I did not recognize, small enough to hide, frequent enough to matter. Fiona tried to explain them away as vendor expenses. I knew every vendor number by memory. None matched. Curtis had been paid. I told Nina to leave. She resisted until I insisted. When the door closed behind her, the apartment felt smaller, tighter, like a room with shrinking oxygen. Fiona tried to pivot, shifting from denial to justification, then to damage control. She framed it as confusion, pressure, stress, and fear of marriage. None of it matched the evidence. I asked about the documents on the desk in the living room. She went quiet. That told me everything before I opened the folder. Inside were preliminary refinancing papers with my name already entered, structured to convert the apartment into shared ownership after marriage. I had not signed them, but the intent was clear. The timing was deliberate. Marriage would have locked me into obligations that made walking away expensive and slow. The betrayal was not emotional. It was strategic. I called Harold Finch, the friend who had helped me organize the wedding budget and vendor flow. It was late, but he answered. I told him to pull the last 3 months of account activity and confirm whether any payments routed to unfamiliar accounts. He did not ask questions. He just said he would call back. Fiona watched me make the call and finally understood that the situation had passed the point where words mattered. She tried to reclaim ground by accusing me of overreacting. That argument collapsed under its own weight the moment my phone rang again. Harold confirmed the irregularities. He had already flagged them internally, but assumed Fiona had explained them to me. The payments led to an account tied to Curtis Vaughn. I told Fiona to pack a bag. She refused, claiming the apartment was her home too. I corrected her. The lease was in my name. The utilities were in my name. The wedding was not a shield anymore. She threatened legal action. I told her the police were on their way to document trespass and financial misuse. That stopped the argument. When the officers arrived, the tone shifted again. No shouting. No performance. Just facts. Curtis had been present without my consent. Funds had been misused. A report was filed. Fiona packed her bag under supervision and left with the same sister who had known more than she admitted. I stood alone in the apartment afterward, surrounded by wedding binders, invitation samples, and seating charts that no longer meant anything. I canceled the wedding venue before midnight. I froze the joint account. I sent a single email to vendors explaining that the event would not proceed. The door had not held. Neither had the lie. By the time I lay down on the bed that night, exhaustion hit in waves, but clarity stayed sharp. What I had uncovered in a single hour told me this was only the surface. The damage ran deeper, and the fallout had not even started. Sleep never came. The apartment felt like a place that had already rejected me, even though my name was still on everything that mattered. I spent the rest of the night moving from room to room, opening drawers and closets I had never had a reason to question. What I found confirmed that the previous evening was not an isolated collapse, but the moment a longer structure finally failed. There were clothes that were not mine, folded carefully in a guest closet. There were receipts in a jacket pocket that Fiona had never worn around me. There was a second charger behind the couch that did not fit either of our phones. Each discovery came with a quiet sense of inevitability, like evidence that had been waiting for permission to exist. By morning, messages had already begun to circulate. Fiona's mother called first, then her father, then a cousin who pretended to be neutral while asking questions that leaned toward blame. I did not answer. I sent one short message explaining that the wedding was canceled due to infidelity and financial misconduct. I kept it factual and unembellished. I did not owe anyone tone management. I left the apartment just after sunrise to meet Harold at his office. He had stayed up most of the night reviewing transaction histories and pulling records that went beyond the wedding account. What he found widened the scope of what I had walked into. The payments to Curtis were only part of it. There were overlapping transfers routed through Fiona's personal account, timed to coincide with my reimbursements from work. The pattern was deliberate. Small amounts, frequent enough to avoid notice, consistent enough to support someone without raising alarms. Curtis had not just been visiting. He had been maintained. Harold explained that if I had married Fiona, the legal entanglement would have complicated recovery. Joint liability would have blurred intent. The window to act cleanly was now, while the damage was still traceable. While we were talking, my phone lit up again. This time it was Nina. She asked to meet. She framed it as concern, as regret, as an attempt to help contain the fallout. I agreed, not because I trusted her, but because she was already part of the machinery that had worked against me. Avoiding her would not undo that. We met at a cafe near her office. She arrived early, already rehearsed, already positioned as reasonable. She apologized without fully apologizing, expressing sorrow without responsibility. She insisted she had believed Fiona would end things before the wedding. She insisted she never thought it would reach this point. What she could not explain was why Curtis had felt comfortable enough to return to my apartment after being thrown out, or why he believed he had a future that began the moment I signed marriage papers. Nina's answers shifted when I pressed. Details slipped. Timelines changed. She admitted she had met Curtis more than once. She admitted she had helped Fiona keep schedules aligned. She justified it as protecting her sister from making a mistake, without acknowledging that the mistake involved dismantling someone else's life in advance. I ended the meeting without resolution. I did not need one. Her role was clear. When I returned to the apartment, a courier was waiting with a package addressed to Fiona. I signed for it without thinking. Inside were documents from a lender, confirming pre-approval for refinancing contingent on marriage. Fiona had moved further than I realized. She had not just prepared. She had advanced. I forwarded everything to my attorney. The same afternoon, Curtis tried to contact me. He sent messages asking to retrieve remaining belongings. He framed it as logistics, as closure, as if the previous night had been an inconvenience rather than an exposure. I told him to meet me in a public place and bring identification. He did not understand why until he arrived. I had already spoken with his employer. Curtis worked for a mid-sized logistics firm that tracked time closely. Harold's records showed Curtis had been receiving payments during hours he claimed to be on the clock. I provided evidence of repeated absences tied to dates Fiona and I had been out of town together. The firm had begun its own review before Curtis even sat down across from me. Curtis did not threaten me. He did not posture. He He looked confused in a way that suggested he had believed Fiona's version of events more than he admitted. He thought I was a temporary obstacle. He thought the wedding was a formality, not a commitment. He thought he was being managed toward a reward. When I told him Fiona had already started negotiating reconciliation with me before he was thrown out, his face changed. He asked questions he should have asked months earlier. He demanded explanations he would not get from me. He left with his belongings, and without the certainty he had arrived with. By evening, the story had begun circulating in less controlled ways. Fiona's parents demanded a meeting. They wanted clarification. They wanted assurances. They wanted to know whether this could be fixed quietly. I agreed to meet them only with my attorney present. The meeting was tense but brief. I laid out timelines, documents, and account histories. I explained the circumstances of the discovery and the steps taken since. I did not speculate about motive. I did not exaggerate harm. I let the facts speak in a way emotion could not undo. Fiona was not there. That absence spoke louder than anything I could have said. Her parents asked if I was willing to reconsider. I told them the issue was not forgiveness but exposure. Their daughter had attempted to lock me into a financial structure under false pretenses. Trust was not the primary casualty. Legality was. They left without argument. That night, Fiona tried a different approach. She did not plead. She accused. She framed my actions as vindictive and disproportionate. She threatened to contest the cancellation of shared arrangements. She claimed emotional distress. My attorney responded on my behalf with documentation that made those threats impractical. By the end of the second day, the wedding had unraveled completely. Vendors refunded deposits where possible. Others retained cancellation fees that were covered by the remaining balance in the joint account before it was frozen. Friends began choosing sides without being asked. Some reached out quietly to say they had suspected something. Others disappeared. I changed the locks. That act was less symbolic than necessary. Curtis had access codes. Fiona had shared them. The apartment no longer represented safety without a reset. Late that night, Nina sent one final message. She said she wished things had gone differently. She said she never meant for it to spiral. She asked if there was anything she could do to help. I did not respond. By the end of the second night, the scope of what I had escaped was clearer than the pain of what I had lost. The betrayal was not a single act, but a network of decisions, supported by silence and justified by convenience. The fallout was still building. The most volatile pieces had not yet collided. Curtis believed he had been deceived. Fiona believed she could still control the narrative. Her family believed damage could be contained. They were all wrong, and none of them yet understood how much ground they had already lost. The third day started with silence, which I learned quickly was more dangerous than noise. Silence meant people were comparing notes, aligning stories, and deciding who would move first. By mid-morning, the silence broke. Curtis moved first. He showed up at the apartment building without warning, standing outside the entrance like someone who believed proximity still granted access. The doorman called up to confirm whether Curtis was expected. That single call saved the situation from escalating in public. I went downstairs instead. Curtis looked worn in a way that suggested sleep had not come easily for him either. He did not come angry. He came determined. He believed he had been wronged, not just exposed. He said Fiona had contacted him after being removed from the apartment, insisting that I had manipulated the situation, that I had exaggerated financial issues, and that everything could still be salvaged if he stayed quiet. That was the moment I realized Fiona was attempting to play both sides again, even after everything had collapsed. Curtis asked for proof. I showed him the documents. Not selectively, not strategically, fully. I laid out timelines, payments, and the refinancing pre-approvals that would have locked me into shared ownership weeks after the wedding. I showed him the transaction patterns that supported him while he believed he was being prepared for a future. Curtis did not interrupt. He absorbed the information in the way someone does when the structure they relied on fails at once. He asked one question that mattered. He wanted to know whether Fiona had ever intended to leave me before the marriage. I told him the truth. Based on the evidence, no. Curtis left without a threat and without a plan. That was worse for Fiona than anger. It meant he was done protecting her narrative. The same afternoon, Fiona's parents requested another meeting. This time, they wanted Fiona present. I agreed again, under the same condition as before. The meeting took place in a neutral office space arranged by their attorney. Fiona arrived late. She looked composed but strained, like someone who had rehearsed calm without resting long enough to sustain it. She tried to take control immediately by reframing events as emotional chaos, mutual misunderstanding, and stress-induced mistakes. She avoided timelines. She avoided documents. She leaned on tone. That approach failed quickly. My attorney presented the refinancing documents and the account records in sequence. Fiona tried to interrupt, but stopped when her father asked her to explain specific line items. She could not. She shifted blame to Curtis, claiming he had pressured her financially. That argument collapsed when Curtis's name appeared on deposits that predated his job loss. Her parents watched the version of their daughter they thought they knew lose coherence in real time. The meeting ended without resolution, but it ended with understanding. Fiona's parents were no longer negotiating. They were assessing damage. That night, Curtis released his own version of events to mutual acquaintances, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. He clarified that he had believed Fiona was planning to leave her fiancé after the wedding for logistical reasons. He admitted he had benefited financially without fully questioning the source. He cut ties publicly and removed himself from the situation. That disclosure accelerated everything. Friends who had remained neutral began reaching out with information they had previously withheld. A bridesmaid admitted she had covered for Fiona on weekends. A coworker acknowledged seeing Curtis drop Fiona off near the apartment while I was traveling. The pattern extended wider than I had assumed. Fiona responded by escalating. She filed a claim alleging emotional distress and intimidation, framing my actions as excessive and retaliatory. The claim did not hold, but it signaled a shift from damage control to offense. She wanted leverage. My attorney countered by submitting the police documentation from the night she was removed from the apartment, along with financial evidence that reframed the narrative. The claim stalled almost immediately. The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. Nina contacted my attorney directly, offering cooperation in exchange for limited exposure. She admitted she had helped coordinate schedules and had discouraged Fiona from ending the affair earlier, believing marriage would stabilize the situation. She provided messages that confirmed she knew Curtis was being financially supported with shared funds. That cooperation fractured the last internal alliance Fiona had. By the end of the fourth day, Fiona was isolated. Curtis was gone. Nina had withdrawn support. Her parents were no longer defending her position. The story circulating among extended family and friends was no longer sympathetic. Fiona attempted one final pivot. She requested a private meeting with me, insisting she needed to explain things without intermediaries. I refused. There was nothing left to clarify that documents had not already resolved. She then attempted to re-enter the apartment while I was away, claiming she still had belongings inside. The attempt failed because the locks had been changed and the building staff had been instructed not to grant access without written authorization. That denial triggered her most visible breakdown yet. Security documented the incident. Neighbors noticed. The narrative she had tried to shape quietly now had witnesses. That same evening, my attorney informed me that the refinancing lender had withdrawn the pre-approval entirely after reviewing the dispute. Fiona had burned the bridge she intended to cross. The financial consequences landed faster than the emotional ones. Without access to shared funds, without family support, and without Curtis, Fiona's stability collapsed. She attempted to negotiate temporary support through her parents. They refused until legal matters were resolved. She attempted to negotiate silence from Curtis. He did not respond. I spent that night alone in the apartment, not in reflection, but in preparation. I inventoried assets. I closed accounts. I finalized cancellations. I documented every interaction. The wedding date passed quietly on the calendar. No announcement. No statement. Just another day that no longer carried meaning. The pressure had shifted entirely. Fiona was no longer reacting to me. She was reacting to consequences. The systems she had relied on were no longer available. The people she had expected to manage outcomes had stepped back. The collision was complete. By the time I lay down that night, the situation had crossed the point where reconciliation or reputation management mattered. What remained was cleanup, accountability, and the long shadow of decisions made under the assumption they would never be exposed. The final phase was approaching, not with spectacle, but with permanence. The last phase did not arrive with drama. It arrived with paperwork, deadlines, and the slow compression of options until none were left. That was how everything Fiona had tried to build collapsed, not with shouting or spectacle, but with permanence. The first consequence was legal finality. My attorney filed to formally dissolve every shared obligation that still existed on paper. The joint account was closed after outstanding vendor penalties were settled. The apartment lease was reaffirmed under my sole name with the property management company, accompanied by the police documentation from the night Fiona was removed. That report mattered more than emotion ever could. It created a clean record of when access ended and why. Fiona attempted to contest the closure of the account, claiming she had contributed emotionally and logistically to wedding planning and therefore deserved partial reimbursement. That argument did not survive review. The funds had been used improperly, and the evidence trail was intact. The claim was dismissed without escalation. The second consequence was professional. Curtis's employer completed its internal investigation and terminated his position. The reason was not the affair, but falsified time reporting tied to repeated absences. Curtis did not appeal. He relocated within weeks, quietly and without announcement. His departure ended speculation and confirmed what many had already assumed. Fiona's workplace reacted more slowly, but not more kindly. The situation did not involve her employer directly, but the visibility of the conflict mattered. She had attempted to frame herself as a victim of intimidation during her failed claim. When that narrative collapsed, credibility went with it. She was placed on leave pending review. The leave became permanent separation shortly after. The third consequence was social. The wedding guests who had been invited months earlier learned the truth in fragments. Some heard it from Curtis's version, others from Nina's cooperation, others from Fiona's parents explaining why there would be no ceremony. The lack of a unified story hurt Fiona more than any accusation could have. Contradictions surfaced. Sympathy fractured. Nina withdrew completely. She provided the information she had promised through her attorney and cut contact with Fiona afterward. The explanation she offered privately to relatives was simple and devastating. She said she could no longer protect behavior she had helped excuse. That statement traveled faster than any defense Fiona attempted to mount. Fiona's parents remained silent publicly. Privately, they paid debts that did not involve me and declined to intervene further. Their refusal to fund recovery efforts or legal escalation marked the end of Fiona's ability to defer consequences through family support. The fourth consequence was logistical. Fiona requested supervised access to retrieve remaining belongings from the apartment. The request was granted once, with building security present. The retrieval lasted less than an hour. She took what could be packed quickly and left behind items that had once symbolized permanence. The apartment felt lighter afterward, as if the space itself recognized the separation. After that day, she did not return. The final consequence was internal, and it was the only one that did not involve documents. For weeks, I existed in a state of operational clarity that left little room for reflection. Tasks filled the space where grief might have formed. Only after the systems were shut down and the noise faded did the weight of the near miss register fully. I had not lost a marriage. I had avoided one. The realization carried its own cost. Trust does not reset simply because damage is contained. Patterns linger. Vigilance becomes habitual. I noticed it in how I read emails more carefully, how I questioned timing, how I listened for omissions rather than statements. That shift was not damage, but it was change. Fiona made one final attempt to communicate through her attorney, proposing a settlement that included mutual non-disclosure and a statement framing the situation as a private incompatibility. The proposal included language that would have allowed her to reclaim narrative ground without acknowledging misconduct. I declined. There was nothing to gain from rewriting reality. The matter closed quietly after that. No further filings. No appeals. No statements. The absence of continuation became its own resolution. Months later, I learned through indirect channels that Fiona had moved again, changing cities in search of distance rather than stability. Curtis did not reappear in her orbit. Nina did not reconcile. The network that had supported the deception dissolved under its own weight. I did not follow any of it closely. There was nothing left to monitor. The apartment returned to something resembling neutrality. Wedding materials were discarded or donated. The calendar cleared. Evenings regained shape without anticipation or dread attached to them. Normality returned slowly, not as relief, but as baseline. The experience did not harden me, but it recalibrated thresholds. I no longer assumed alignment based on proximity. I no longer accepted reassurance without verification. Those adjustments did not make life smaller. They made it cleaner. The door that night had not held because it was never meant to. It had been closed to maintain illusion, not security. Pushing through it did not create chaos. It ended it. What followed was not revenge or victory. It was separation from a future built on misrepresentation. That was consequence enough.
Divorced and then got remarried and had another set of kids. And I think that you do what you need to do and you learn a lot along the way and you don't even realize you're learning it. Like in my 20s, I learned so much when I was young. And those experiences led me to a lot of other learnings when I was older. And by the way, a lot of failures.
Yeah, because I mean, we're obviously in our early 20s. We just started our careers and everything feels so important and hard. And I know we read that you actually were a flight attendant in your 20s.
Yes.
What was that like? Are there any lessons you learned that you still use?
Every single lesson that I learned that I really appreciate, I think I learned from that year and a half or 2 years of being a flight attendant. I was the youngest person at the time, I think, in their entire lineup of flight attendants because these flight attendants had had such great seniority